understand over the course of the next half an hour or so the potential for artificial intelligence to really contribute to climate change mitigation, and whether or not its benefits will outweigh its potential risks. The Economist recently described artificial intelligence as the biggest gamble in history, with all this money going into AI data centers, and yet many of the promised outcomes of artificial intelligence yet to be secured. Do you think it will live up to its promise in important areas of human advancement, including climate change? Stephen, are you an AI optimist in that regard?
Well, Robert, first of all, thank you very much.
Just got to switch it on.
Your button, mate, just. Is it on?
It's on the top. Yeah,
just a little button there.
Can I be heard?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent, fantastic. So off to a running start with technology, as is our theme. Robert, I don't know if optimism is the right word. I mean, we confront very serious challenges with AI from a sustainability perspective. We've already seen many of the use cases in terms of sustainability and climate change starting to bear themselves out. There is an adding up problem. You know, is this going to be more helpful or harmful? And you've cited some of those statistics there. But the reality is that the AI genie is not going back into the bottle. So we have to do our best to make it sustainable, to use it where we can, but also to have eyes wide open in terms of the risks and challenges and try to mitigate those if at all possible.
Thank you. Gio, from your perspective and working with the firms that you mentor, doing probably some pretty cutting edge stuff with artificial intelligence, are you excited about the potential for artificial intelligence to really contribute to climate change mitigation and to improving the planet's environmental outcomes?
I think AI's promise right now is kind of like Schrodinger's cat, right? It's neither good or bad, and we won't really know until it fully manifests itself. Because that's really what it is. It's a promise. And we talked a little bit earlier about how some people, like Sam Altman, are kind of pitching a certain worldview of AI. But the truth is we don't really know where it's going to go. And that's part of the beauty of it and part of the appeal of it. What I see today, though, is there is significant promise, and I'm an optimist. I'm a technologist optimist in general. But I think if you were to take a stock of what the ledger is today, we're probably a little bit in the blood, meaning I think AI at the moment is probably doing a little bit more harm than it's doing good. But I definitely believe that over time, things can turn in its favor of AI becoming a force for good. I take a very romantic, positive notion to AI, whereas people sometimes look at it as, because we talk about Skynet is going to destroy the world. The flip side of that is, what if AI amplifies the good in humanity, right? What if it becomes a greater good that is kind of like amplifying everything that's inside us that makes us good? And so I think ultimately it will be good. That's my answer to your question. For the time being, though, if I look at the environmental impacts, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later in more detail, it's not as good, probably, as it should be.
Because of its energy and water consumption?
Well, I mean, yeah, if you want to look at some stats, right? Like, so I work with a government in Central Asia that does a lot of stuff on green energy, and particularly on compute for AI models, because that's really where a lot of the waste is. People tend to focus on training AI models, but that's really not where a lot of the energy consumption happens. It's really in the inference, right? Daily use, whenever we use these models to kind of answer very basic, sometimes banal questions. And so what my team kind of came up with, one of the startups we're working with, in the next 3 to 5 years, they expect that the energy consumption for all data compute centers globally will be the size of Germany and France combined. They expect that the water consumption will be equivalent to Denmark. And if Denmark is not really a good reference, maybe half of the UK in terms of water consumption, right? So clearly there's significant impacts, but there's also things that AI can do to kind of like help address and mitigate some of those.
Okay, let's focus in then on the possibilities. And Stephen, perhaps you can talk to us about some of the most promising applications of artificial intelligence in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What are you seeing out there at the moment, and what do you think artificial intelligence can do in its most practical sense to really start to make a difference?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do at the United Nations, of course, as well as participating in projects to apply AI, is try and take stock of what's already out there in terms of its possibilities. Now, from a climate perspective, there are AI projects which are assisting with both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. If we want to focus here on mitigation, on reducing or lowering greenhouse gas emissions, we see positive use cases in areas ranging from energy to transport to preventing deforestation. As we know, forests are natural carbon sinks. So AI is being used in the energy space, in electricity, renewable energy, for real-time demand management, so there is less consumption necessary to help avoid curtailment of renewable energy, so you have less need to rely on fallbacks in terms of fossil fuels, and so forth. Now, AI is not magic, of course. So what we're talking about is using the data crunching and the pattern recognition capacities of AI together with real-time sensors, using the Internet of Things, of course, and using historical data as well as real-time data to achieve changes or tweaks in how an electricity grid or decentralized renewable works in real time. Now, very similar to transport management, of course. So various large cities, Seoul in South Korea is a good example, is deploying AI for active transport management. So you think about this in terms of modifying slightly when the lights are green or red, in order that public transport gets to its destination faster, in order that there is less idling of vehicles and therefore less emissions associated with that, and so forth. So it's not a magic solution, but it is helping in those cases at the margin. And finally, forestry, preserving forests as natural carbon sinks, AI analysis allied to satellite data, allied to on-the-ground sensors to identify where is the highest carbon stock forests, and therefore government and local volunteers can focus on protecting those areas from forest fires or from illegal deforestation. So again, this doesn't answer the adding up problem, but these are real-world use cases that are already in practice.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the adding up problem is interesting. I was struck by Gio's point that, you know, the energy consumption of artificial intelligence could equal that of 2 major EU countries in a relatively short period of time. So any optimization of energy systems that AI can provide needs to be balanced, I guess, against its own voracious consumption of energy. Do you think actually that from a net perspective, artificial intelligence will potentially lead to a reduction of energy consumption?
Yeah, so a couple of things to say about that. First of them is that our own survey found that AI, the electricity associated with AI use, is something like 0.01% of global emissions, which is not negligible, but it is also not apocalyptic. Yeah. The other thing to say is that a lot of those future projections are pre-DeepSeek. Okay, yeah. They're pre the early 2025 models coming out of China, which suggested, reported, and no one's really challenged this, that the outcomes of those models can be achieved with far lower raw computing power.
Yeah.
So perhaps
they're much less energy intensive.
Effectively, yes. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't eventually get to that problem of rampant electricity use greater than the mitigation, but I think I would be hesitant about straight line predictions from where we were even now, let alone 6 months ago.
Thank you, Stephen. Gio, just then in terms of some of the organizations you're working with, some of the founders, particularly working in the AI space, what are some of the most promising applications of AI that you're witnessing that could help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Are there some real-life practical examples that are attracting funding, that are starting to gear up to actually make a difference?
Yeah, before I get into that, let me first agree with Stephen on what he just said. I think the era of straight line predictions are over. I think that's one thing that AI has kind of shown. We use them as benchmarks and as baselines to kind of tell a narrative, obviously, because it's a little bit easier. But at the same time, I fundamentally agree that we don't really know what's happening. Nobody saw DeepSeek coming, right? And nobody will see the next, whatever the next version of DeepSeek is, coming most likely. Now, back to the specific use cases. you talked about deforestation. There's a company called Bumitra that I recently invested in that's doing some really interesting stuff. They take satellite images and drone footage, and then they use bespoke AI models to effectively analyze soil, but also then to help farmers increase the crop yield. And how do they do that? Well, it's because they are able to analyze water wastage and a couple of other things. Then they do local interventions on the ground with farmers to teach them skills to better use the land. Now, this is good at many different levels, right? It's good for the farmers because the farmers get a better yield for their crops, which means they get more money. It's good for the country because actually it goes into food supply. It's good for water because you waste less water. And then on the back of it, they're able to take some of the carbon they're sequestering through these different practices and then turn them into credits, sell those credits. You know, in this case, we have two of the big oil companies as off-takers that are basically saying any credit coming out will immediately buy those because they're compliance credits, right? There's a big market these days for compliance credits, especially in industries that have signed up voluntary for certain targets. So we sell those credits, and then 80% of the proceeds go back into the farmer, right? So the farmer gets more money, better knowledge, works the land better, sequesters more carbon, and becomes a bit of a flywheel, small flywheels of sort. Now, that's the very romanticized, great version of what this is. The flip side is that these projects are very expensive, and you need to raise a ton of money in order to be able to get those results. And many of these results only manifest over a long period of time. And so that leads me into, as my banker, one of the biggest problems that I see. I'll be curious to hear also Stephen's perspective on that from a regulatory perspective, right? So projects like this needs to be funded. They're long-term. But we as banks have very little incentives to do that. Because instead of putting $10 away today for something that in 10 years might be good, I can put that today in a short-term loan in an industry like oil and gas, where my return is a given, right? And so that's what my board would want. That's what my finance guys would want. And so how do you balance that? Because sustainable finance is great, but the incentives, I think, are not very much aligned with corporations' incentives.
That's interesting. So where do we go with that? Does that mean that there is a much more important role for government to essentially provide guarantees on some of these investments?
I think one of the projects I'm looking at now is carbon credits in particular, right? So we're working with another company, a family office, that is working with a large African government to do this. One of the biggest problems that we saw from a financing perspective is when the US pulled out of the Paris Accords, there was a bit of a shock and a little bit of an anticipation of what's going to happen next. It became more difficult with some of these compliance credits because when you buy these credits, you need to sort of know that they will be still valuable, right? Like it's a fairly big investment. Now, on this particular project, we actually have the World Bank stepping in now and guaranteeing them. They set up this new guarantee fund, which I think is really great because you need these kind of like cross-national entities to help support that. With the World Bank stepping in and saying that even if, 4, 5, 6, 10 other countries leave the Paris Accords, we still are guaranteeing the validity of these credits and the monetary value associated with it. It's a lot easier for us as a bank to then finance them, and it's a lot easier for companies to purchase them. And so I'm not working on the regulatory side. I think you do a lot more work in that space, which is interesting. I'm actually on the opposite side, on the UN. Like I'm advocating for self-regulation of AI in developing countries because there's the opportunity to leapfrog. But then there's the flip side of that, which is as that happens, what does that mean for energy consumption over time? My sense, by the way, is this. I agree, models become more efficient, model architecture will become more efficient, but the use cases of which will also increase spectacularly, right? And so that's the angle that I don't know. So maybe it will be less energy consumption on a model side, but if more and more people start using them for more and more tasks, is that maybe mitigating the savings you have on the one hand? I said a lot of different things. So actually, I'd love to hear Stephen's view on that from a regulatory perspective.
Thank you, Gio. Yes, let's bring Stephen in on that point. I mean, you made a fascinating comment there around the role of international bodies such as the World Bank, but also you brought in the idea of the importance of effective regulation. And I guess this is something that you're looking at in great detail, Stephen. What is effective regulation of artificial intelligence in respect of its potential to mitigate the harms of climate change, what can be done by those regulators to ensure that we can take full advantage of the technology and also minimize its harm?
Yes, well, regulation is primarily, I would suggest, a national responsibility. So there is, as far as I can tell, there is not going to be a detailed, binding UN framework regulator. There's not going to be the AI treaty that tells you to do or not do certain things from an environmental perspective. So many countries have an AI Act or a draft AI Act, the European Union, of course, at a regional level. Other countries are more in the direction of self-regulation, either by design or default, because there is legislative gridlock. So countries will choose their own perspective and their own road. From the international perspective, the United Nations has developed a number of, shall we say, soft instruments. So not normative, not telling countries what to do, but saying these are important considerations to take into account, also from an environmental perspective. UNESCO, in terms of the ethical dimensions of AI use, including environmental matters. Since Gio already mentioned the potential for leapfrogging of developing countries, there is tremendous attention at the UN level to the need to assist developing countries with capacity building for artificial intelligence so that AI does not simply deepen the digital divide, that we do not have AI winners and AI losers. Now that perhaps sounds utopian from certain perspectives, but the international community recognizes that need from the UN General Assembly down. And in the context of the Conference of Parties, and we're talking about COP28 in Dubai, right? COP28 in Dubai was the meeting when the parties to the Paris Agreement for the first time addressed artificial intelligence. And their focus was precisely that it needs to be implemented in a way that does not leave developing countries behind, and also from a climate perspective has proper attention to the environmental risks and challenges. So I think we're not going to have the UN telling countries what to do, which most of us will be happy about, but we do have hopefully some value add from the UN level, particularly in terms of helping developing countries. And of course what we're doing in the Climate Technology Centre and Network is under that very mandate itself.
I suppose if we follow to its logical conclusion your point that regulation in this space is likely to be done at a national level, it does mean that there will be something of a patchwork quilt of regulation around the world, which will be, I guess, quite difficult for technology companies and those looking to take advantage of those technologies to navigate. We heard Gio say he's probably in favor of light touch regulation or self-regulation. From your perspective, where do you think the balance needs to be struck between a facilitative environment and a regulatory environment? We talked yesterday about the importance of a blend of carrot and stick in regards to regulation. From your perspective, what will work best in order to enable AI to play its role in climate change mitigation, but again, not to let it run wild?
Yeah, well, there are certain regulatory aspects which are general to technology and include AI in terms of creating a market that attracts inbound investment, which most countries will require, things such as property rights, credible dispute resolution, etc. And then you get into the specifics of AI, and we know that there are certain things that that one needs to guard against, such as bias in the data or in the algorithm, which is effectively discriminatory, or indeed challenges to do with improper assumptions, because it's simply been cut and pasted from a different country with very different circumstances, economic, social, climate, etc. So those are some of the regulatory concerns, but you'll appreciate it's difficult to be too granular because every country will have its own concerns. What we can do at the international level is simply set out these are some of the things you should be aware of, and of course assist countries to the extent that countries in a sovereign perspective wish to be assisted with development of laws and regulations and so forth.
Thank you. Yeah, and that sort of brings us on to the idea of how to ward against unintended consequences through the development of AI. You talked about the risk of inbuilt bias within algorithms, of discrimination. Again, from your perspective, Gio, is that something that you as an investor in this space, as somebody working with technology companies, are particularly aware of?
Yeah, I think, yes, 100%. I think even as an investor, right, like the principles that you would use for regulation, and to me there's three, I think very similar to what Stephen mentioned, right? An AI model needs to be transparent, it needs to be explainable, and it needs to be validated, right? Out-of-sample testing is very, very important. But then if you take the example as a bank, we invest in AI. And one of the things obviously banks are looking at now is, can you use AI models to predict who is credit worthy, right, when it comes to loans? Now here's the problem with that. Depending on your existing data set, which often, by the way, for most banks is skewed, because there's usually a strategic element in terms of how we select our customers. So now if we want to expand, customer bases will heavily favor, at least in our case, and this is a bank in Dubai, it heavily favors men. It heavily favors men at a certain age, of certain nationalities, with a certain amount of income, right? That's just the way that we've always focused on. Everybody wants high net worth individuals. If a woman were to apply for a loan and we had a full AI model running that, just by the proportion of women in the data set, there would have been a bias against women. Because there's a fewer of them, if one of them defaults, by comparison, proportionally, the data set will be significantly skewed against that, right? And so these are some of the risks. It's the same thing when people use AI for hiring, which I'm fundamentally against. And it's the same problem. Like, it just skews towards what you've been hiring already, or the distribution of the workforce in your country, which is usually not very inclusive. Sorry, I'm just fiddling with this. And so when I look at these things, as an investor, I obviously look at what's the best value for money, but at the same time, we also want to make sure we invest in ethical products. There's quite a few AI solutions that came up that were super interesting from a commercial perspective, but we just felt like this is not the way that we want the world to evolve. And so, maybe someone else wants to fund you. It's not going to be us, because ultimately I also have to think about my family and my kids and the world around.